Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pastor Kris Shoemaker. I'm the pastor of the Plaster Rock United Baptist Church just down the road. And I tell you, we had such a big day today. We were kind of in a rush to get here. It's Pentecost Sunday. We're celebrating Father's Day early. We had a couple of graduates in our church that we honored today. And then we had a potluck after church. And then a former pastor came in, was our guest speaker. My goodness, what a whirlwind of a day. And so we have the privilege of coming here, so we're a little bit scatterbrained, maybe a little bit in a food coma, but we're happy to be here and always look forward to the time that we can come and minister to you and see you once again. So today I want to talk about an unpopular subject. I'm going to talk about age. Yeah, phooey, right? Well, but yeah, boo, yeah, Shirley's right, boo. That's one thing about living this life is we're growing older. As long as we're 6 feet above, we're going to be growing older until the day that we die. But that's not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of times the best is yet to come. You know, we think that we've lived our best, but, you know, if you read the Word of God, a lot of great things happen to people when they were past their prime. Now, I don't think anybody's here reached 100 yet, have they? Maybe some are coming close. But, you know, so we'll start from the Word of God from the beginning. And they lived a lot longer back then, granted. But in Genesis 5:23, it says that Noah was over 500 years old when he built the ark. Yeah, Noah was 500 years old, over 500 when he built the ark. That's quite a feat. That's quite of an accomplishment. That would be like maybe, that'd almost be like Ron building a 2-story house at his age. I mean, he's a good builder. He's still out there tinkers in his garage and workshop and stuff, so he still builds things, but that'd be like him building a 2-story house at his age. So Noah was over 500 when he built the ark. Now, he had help from his 3 sons, which was pretty nice. But the best is yet to come. He was able to start a whole new world after the flood. Then he had Abraham. You know, a lot of times when people get married, they're looking forward to having children. Not only are they looking forward to having children, they're looking forward to having grandchildren. You can't spoil your kids, but you can spoil your grandchildren. You know, because you can spoil them and then you get to send them back home, right? Back to their parents, and then they can annoy their parents. So we dote a little bit more over our grandchildren. But poor Abraham, he was 100 years old and he still didn't have any children. And when he died, all of his wealth and everything that he owned was going to go to his servant Eliezer. And Eliezer was a top-notch guy, but he wasn't a blood relative. He was just a servant. So he prayed and he prayed and he prayed for a child. And he tried to, you know, today we have in vitro fertilization and we have surrogate mothers. Well, back then they had sort of a similar thing. They had what's called concubine, and you just had another woman have a baby for you. So they had Ishmael, and Abraham thought, well, this is my way of having children. But God said, no, I'm promising you your own son through your wife Sarah. And sure enough, at 100 years old, and Sarah was 90, can any of you imagine having a baby at 90 years old? You're like, forget about it. Oh my goodness. That's a scary thought. But Sarah was 90 years old and Abraham was 100 before they had Isaac. Now, they had their names were changed. And it's kind of interesting. And, you know, if you notice, I'm wearing a kippah. So I'm a believer in Jesus, but I come from the Jewish tradition. So there's some kind of neat things in the Jewish tradition that talk about Abraham and Isaac. Or Abraham and Sarah. Before they were Abraham and Sarah, his name was Abram, and her name was Sarai. They were missing the letter H from their name. Now that letter H in the Hebrew is the letter He. And that letter He is part of God's Hebrew name. His Hebrew name is Yud-He-Vav-He, and some people say Yahweh. That's breath, right? Because we know in the beginning that when God created Adam, he said that he breathed into his nostrils, gave a mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So Abram and Sarah couldn't have any children because they didn't have any life in them. So God said, I got an idea. I'm going to change their names. I'm going to call him Abraham and add that H, add that He, that breath of life. And I'm going to call her Sarah and add that breath of life to her name. So it's Abraham and Sarah. And that breath of life brought rejuvenation to them, and they were able to have Isaac. So at 100 years old, Abraham became the father of Isaac. And as we know, Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had the 12 tribes of Israel. So the best is yet to come. Noah was 500 when he built the ark. Abraham was 100 when he had Isaac, and Sarah was 90. And Jacob was 130 years old when he was reunited with his long-lost son Joseph. Now, I don't know if any of you has long-lost relatives that you've been longing to see, or maybe that they went away and you just never know where they went to, and you're thinking, well, will I ever see him again? Well, Jacob thought Joseph was dead. His brothers, Joseph's brothers were really jealous of him because he was the baby of the family and he was daddy's favorite. And he was the son of his favorite wife. And so Jacob just doted over Joseph. Gave him a big fancy coat, which symbolized that he was going to rule his family one day. And then on top of that, Joseph started having these really wild and crazy dreams that one day all of his brothers would bow down to him and serve him. And they're like, we'll fix that guy. So when his father told Joseph to go out to the field and check on his brothers while they were keeping sheep and kind of tattletale, report back to him what was going on, his brother's like, hey, look, here comes that dreamer. Well, let's kill him and see what comes of his dreams. So at first they were going to kill him, but then one of the older brothers says, no, let's not do that. Let's not be guilty of murder. Let's make a profit off of him. Let's sell him to somebody else and let him be somebody else's problem. So they sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt, and they took his nice and pretty colorful cloak, and they dipped it in goat's blood, brought it back to their father, and said, hey, Dad, is this your son's coat? Yes, I'd know that coat anywhere. It's Joseph's. Oh, my goodness, he must have been ate by a wild animal. An animal must have tore him up. He's dead. So Jacob thought that Joseph was long gone, and he was never happy. His other sons and his daughters and his family couldn't console him. But when he was 130 years old, there was a famine in the land. And so all of his brothers had to go to Egypt to get food. And by this time, Joseph went from slavery to prison, which is a lot worse than being a slave. But from the prison, he made it to the throne of Egypt. Because he was able to interpret Pharaoh's dream, he was given the second-in-command title of Egypt. And he had this great program of how to save Egypt from famine. Because there were going to be 7 years of plenty where they could stock up and save up, and 7 years of famine. So during these 7 years of famine, his brothers came to get grain from Egypt. And so to make a long story short, they discovered that their little brother, who they sold into slavery, was second in command of Egypt. And so they brought their father Jacob. And so 130 years later, when Jacob thought that life was over, life wasn't worth living because his son was dead, found out after all that his son was alive. Not only was his son alive, he was second in command of Egypt. So we also have Moses. Everybody knows about Moses. He brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. And he had it pretty good at first because he was adopted into Pharaoh's family. And he was next in line as a prince of Egypt. He was probably going to rule Egypt one day. But things kind of went south and he had to go into exile. And God called him out of exile in order to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. So after he left Egypt and was no longer able to be a ruler in Egypt, he thought my life was over. Great, now I have to watch after all these stinky sheep because he'd become a shepherd. And Egyptians hated shepherds. They hated sheep. And so it was a very degrading thing for Moses to have to take care of sheep. But while he was taking care of sheep one day, God called him from the burning bush and said, I want you to lead my children out of bondage in Egypt. He wasn't 20 years old. He wasn't 30 years old. He wasn't in his prime. He was over the hill. He was 80 years old when God called him into ministry. 80 years old when he called him to go to Egypt and lead the children of Israel. So it doesn't matter how old you are. The best is yet to come. It doesn't matter how old you are. God's not finished with you yet. As long as you're 6 feet above ground, God still has a purpose for you. Whether it's giving advice to younger people, to your children or grandchildren, or ministering to those around you that you live with, God still has a purpose for you being here. and you are still a blessing to the Lord. So just because you're past your prime, just because you may think you're over the hill, and just because you might be sick and disabled, doesn't mean that God is finished with you. It could be that the best is yet to come. And Samson, he wasn't necessarily old when he died, but he was disabled when he died. He kind of lived a rough life. He kind of partied a lot, didn't really follow God's commandments. And as a result, the Philistines ended up capturing him and taking his eyes out. Now, up to that point, Samson was a mighty warrior, and he took out a lot of Philistines, which were the enemies of Israel. But in his death, he took out more Philistines than he ever did in his life. Because when he had his eyes plucked out, and they were making fun of him, they were in the temple of the pagan god Dagon. And he said, Lord, let me be able to, pay these Philistines back for taking my eyes. Let me do one more great thing for you before I die. Don't be finished with me yet. I'm still alive, so I still got a purpose. Give me one last burst of strength. And as a result, he pushed those columns in that Dagon temple and collapsed the temple, and all the Philistines were killed. So he did more at the end of his life than he did at the first. So if you're still 6 feet above ground, God's not finished with you yet. And God still wants to use you for his glory. And I think that's kind of an encouraging message because, I'm still a young pup. I'm just in my 40s. But sometimes I remember I was in a lost place in my life. I was just hitting my 30s, getting out of my 20s, hitting in my 30s, and I just felt purposeless and aimless in my life. And I thought, God, what am I going to do? I'm just spinning my wheels. Is this all there is? Am I done with ministry? Have I done it all? Why do I feel so aimless? And God said, call your dad. So my dad has been gone. He's been with the Lord 10 years now. But I remember I called him that day, and I talked to him, and I just poured my heart out to my dad. And I said, Dad, I just feel so lost and so aimless. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. I'm not even sure what I'm supposed to do for God anymore. My dad got really quiet. He said, son, I've never told anyone this. He said, but I feel like I was called to preach and I missed my calling. That surprised me. My dad thought that God had called him to be a preacher, but little did my dad understand and know that even though he didn't have pastor or reverend before his name, just because he wasn't pastor of a church, God still used him as a pastor. I said, Dad, you fulfilled your calling. He says, what do you mean? I said, you have been the Sunday school superintendent at our church ever since I can remember, and every time you dismissed the kids to class, you had a little verse of scripture that you read and a little devotional. You preached a little sermon every Sunday. You preached. And he thought about that. I said, when somebody's sick, where are you? Well, I'll usually visit them at the hospital. I said, well, there you go. That's what a pastor does. Well, and what if somebody comes to the altar? Well, I'll usually go and pray with them. Yeah, he was at every funeral. He was at every hospital bed. He did the work of a pastor without having the title of a pastor. I said, Dad, you didn't miss your calling. You just fulfilled your calling in a different way that wasn't expected. And through that encounter, God inspired me to say, you know what? You're following in your father's footsteps. I want you to preach. I want you to teach my word. And so that kind of got me back on track. So it was because of my dad, who was elderly, and the advice that he had to give me, and that story that shocked me, that he told me that he was called to preach and felt like he never fulfilled his calling, that did something in my heart. And that changed my life forever. And so here I stand before you today, pastoring the church just down the road. And maybe if my dad never told me that, maybe I wouldn't be standing here today. But because I'm alive, because you're alive, God has a reason and a purpose for you being here. And all you've got to do, you don't really have to do anything. You don't even have to figure it out. All you've got to do is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you're doing those two things, you're automatically going to fulfill your calling for God. All right, thank you so much. AbrahamsDescendants.com, getting back to the first century in a 21st century way. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to press the like button as well as the subscribe button if you haven't done so already, and the notification bell that'll let you know every time I make a new video. And don't forget to share this with a friend. Also, visit our website at AbrahamsDescendants.com. Thanks. Shalom. Thanks for watching. Stay connected by subscribing to our other social media accounts and visiting our website at abrahamsdescendants.com.